Welcome guys, Mr. Hyatt here. This is part 2 of the AP Environmental Chapter 9 lecture over agriculture and soil and pesticides. This video is probably mostly going to focus on soil. We're starting off looking at topsoil, which remember is the very top layer of the soil. Pretty creative name there. It's a really significant natural capital, like a big part of our natural capital, because we need basically our food either grows in the topsoil or eats something that grows in the topsoil. So it's really important for us to protect topsoil. Topsoil renewal is one of Earth's most important ecosystem services. Think of if we didn't have decomposers in the environment, we would have to add even more fertilizers and things like that to the soil. So since we're removing nutrients constantly, we have to supplement those, or we have to find a way to let soil rehab itself a little bit better. So here's a general, like it says on the screen, a general soil profile. So essentially, soil, remember, is nutrient rich. So over here, dirt, well, really we've got bedrock that's pummeling itself up, and that's becoming dirt. Then we get some moss and some lichen, so this should look a lot like primary succession. We get some small photosynthesizers that die and get their nutrients cycled into the soil, and now we have soil. But it's still not real nutrient rich, so we can grow some grasses and some small shrubs, but we definitely can't grow trees or anything real water intensive like a fern. So these eventually are going to die, and then we're going to have some nutrients. Notice how much darker the soil is colored than is this soil. That's supposed to represent how nutrient rich the soil is. Once there are nutrients in the soil, now you're going to have things to consume those nutrients. You're going to have trees on top. You're going to have things like ferns. You're going to have more things like bacteria, more things like mites and beetles and moles and things like that once there are nutrients. I want to point out the horizons over here. That's going to be really important later for us. We're not quite to that point yet. But notice that the A horizon is where it's kind of like the state line. Above the A horizon is topsoil. Below the A horizon is subsoil. So anytime you talk about soil, of course you got to talk about erosion. Erosion is going to be moving soil from one place to another. Could be caused by flowing water like we've seen in the Grand Canyon. Could be by wind. That's something that a lot of us don't really think about. Certainly, my farm field has a massive open farm field behind it. It's like 80 some acres. And there's not a lot of wind breaks, so the wind moves pretty quickly across that field. Definitely on dry, when we go like 2 or 3 weeks that are dry, I see a lot of dirt blowing around. That farmer's losing topsoil, losing those nutrients. Remember, the B horizon or the subsoil is not going to have the nutrients in it that the topsoil is. So if you lose that fertile topsoil, kind of in trouble. And if you farm, you're going to expose the land because you're going to disc it up. You're going to loosen it up, basically. You're going to make it more vulnerable to erosion. Same thing with deforestation. You get rid of trees. Now you don't have things to suck up water. You don't have those water reservoirs. So you're going to see more erosion. And same thing with overgrazing because you're tamping it down and you're causing all those same things. So what happens? What are the negative sides of soil erosion? Well, if you're losing the topsoil, then you're losing your nutrients. So you're going to lose some of your fertility. You're going to have lower yields and things along those lines. Of course, we know all about the sediment pollution of surface waters. We know about runoff and all those types of things. So that's certainly involved with soil erosion as well. So erosion releases the soil's carbon content. Essentially, it's going to manipulate the carbon cycle, causing more carbon dioxide to evaporate into the air when it would be dissolved into the soil. So what other kinds of soil pollution do we see? Anything that's in the atmosphere is definitely going to be in the soil. So if there's a poison in the air, it's going to diffuse into the soil and definitely is going to get into water. Of course, we're going to have industrial plants, power plants, motor. You guys know where pollution comes from. Check out that stat on China there. 19% of their farmable land is contaminated by toxic chemicals, or mostly by toxic chemicals. So 19% of their land is essentially unusable or they're going to have to rehab the soil. It's going to be a very difficult process. Desertification is a word I struggle to say, but it's a process where the potential of the topsoil falls by 10% or more. So it's essentially sucking the nutrients out of soil. Overgrazing, deforestation, and definitely excessive plowing cause desertification. Too much irrigation can cause desertification. You're turning soil into a desert. Never a good thing. So we've looked at irrigation in pretty good detail. 70% of human water goes to irrigation. We know that. Irrigation water has a variety of salts which can lead to salinization. You put too much water that has too much salt on your soil, you're essentially adding salt to your plants, and that almost always is bad. Think about what salt does to humans. People that have high blood pressure can't eat much salt. It messes with their blood pressure because it messes with our water regulation. At least 10% of our irrigated cropland suffers from salinization at some level. We can neutralize the salt. Of course, we can do chemistry. But again, you're adding chemicals, and some of those are going to have unintended consequences. Also, in cases where you see flood irrigation or you see too much irrigation, your water table is going to be raised, which is going to deprive those plants of oxygen. It's going to harm and kill your crops, because if the water table raises, then you're sucking you're sucking oxygen down into the water. How does agriculture contribute to air pollution and climate change? Well, a couple of ways. Number one is we cut down a lot of trees to make farm ground. Number two, we add chemicals to the air, whether it's pesticides, fertilizers, whether it's ammonia that is coming from the livestock through their urine, things along those lines. Again, when we're talking about industrialized ag, we're not talking about a handful of cows urinating. We're talking about thousands of cattle urinating all in a small space. So that's a concentration of ammonia that's going to go somewhere. And then we generate a ton of CO2 through just driving around our tractors and all that kind of stuff. Release of CH4 through livestock gas. That's methane, CH4. And you'll see next week there are other sources of methane, not just cow farts. And then we see nitrates through manure and spreading through synthetic inorganic fertilizer. So again, those things they play along with the things that we add to the environment. Let me go back to that slide. Think about the fact that there is so much of this CH4 in the air, because part of it is because cows ferment grass in their stomach, and then they release that the gases from fermentation, and one of the products is methane. So lots of people will dismiss climate change and say, "Oh, it's all cow farts. It's not human. It's not human caused. It's cow farts. It's cow's fault." Okay, why do we have so many cows? If you want to make that argument, why do we have so many cows? Is that a natural population, or is that something that we have augmented because we have an unsustainable desire for meat? I think you guys know the answer to that, and it all comes back to us. So we definitely lose biodiversity with our current food production strategies. Here we go again, slash and burn. Of course, you're cutting down a rainforest and you're replacing it with 2 varieties of crops. You've lost a lot of biodiversity. Palm oil is something that we haven't talked about. You'll see some about that next week. But it's really, really devastating to, especially in Asia. That's a really leading cause of deforestation in Asian countries. Yeah. We're going to learn a lot about this next week, so let me run through it really quickly, and then we'll get into it, like I said, in detail later. Everybody wants meat. Everybody doesn't, or nobody wants to pay a lot for it. So how can you make a lot of meat cheaply? Well, anytime you have to do something cheaply, you're going to have to do it to scale. You're going to have factory farms. It's a lot cheaper to have a massive 6A high school than it is to have 5 3A high schools, because You have to have one principal and one assistant principal and one set of custodians and one set of cafeteria workers and all those types of things. So same thing certainly applies to cattle. It's cheaper to raise cattle all together because you're aggregating, you're concentrating your resources in one place, but you're going to have a lot of waste piling up. You're going to need a lot of inputs there. So some of those implicit costs start to add up when you start to go to scale. Same is true of aquaculture. Gene pool disruption by escaped fish, that happens a lot. Overfishing of wild-caught fisheries. Of course, we've overfished all of our wild fisheries. Don't forget about the things like fish oil and things like luteinizing hormones and things that we pull from fish to put into other things like vitamins and minerals. Don't just focus on the fish that we consume for our diet. We use fish for a lot of stuff. So how can we protect crops and pests more sustainably? We're getting into integrated pest management. So what we want to do is, the idea behind integrated pest management is let's do a little bit of everything and not a lot of anything. Because a little bit of everything, we can reduce the amount of chemicals that we're adding if we do a little bit of everything. So first things first, we need to come to a common understanding of what the word pest means. So a pest, any species that interferes with human welfare by eating society's food, invading homes, lawns, or gardens, destroying building materials, spreading disease, invading ecosystems, or a nuisance. So that could be an insect. That could also be a plant. So don't think pests are just animals. Notice we've got invasive species here. Those can be plants. Plants can destroy building materials. Plants can spread disease. Plants definitely invade ecosystems, and they can definitely be a nuisance. So notice here, natural enemies control most pest species. That's a free ecosystem service. Example, I have bats at my home. I don't love bats, but bats control bugs. I didn't introduce the bats, but I'm also not going to run them off because they perform a free ecosystem service. I have fewer mosquitoes at my house because I have bats. I have fewer of lots of different types of insects because I have bats. So that's kind of what we're getting at with integrated pest management. Can we mimic nature and do things that nature already does and reduce the amount of artificial chemicals that we're putting down? Now, we're really good at making chemicals. That's why this sometimes is a problem. There definitely are advantages of synthetic pesticide use. Tons of lives have been saved from insect-transmitted diseases, especially malaria. We put down a ton of DDT, killed a ton of mosquitoes. Now, we also killed some people, but we also killed a ton of mosquitoes. There are better ways to stop malaria now, but at the time there wasn't. Food supplies are certainly increased by reducing crop loss due to pests. Yields have increased. Profits have increased. Newer pesticides are definitely safer and more effective and work faster, especially when you can target them to a specific species. If you can target your pesticide to one pest, it's safer and it's gonna be more effective. Or if you can target your pesticide to one crop type, again, you're gonna be more successful and you're gonna be able to use less pesticide. So what are the disadvantages? Well, you're gonna have, anytime you're applying pesticide, applying anything, what I'm getting at is you're causing evolution to happen. You're going to have pesticide resistance. You're going to have herbicide resistance. Long-term usage is going to diminish its effectiveness. Same deal. You use it long enough, you're going to have a ton of resistance. Even the organisms that aren't fully resistant are going to be partially resistant. Insecticides often are going to kill the pest's natural enemies, so you're kind of cascading. You're going to have to add more pesticide next year because you took out the pest and its predator. It's inefficient. We put down way too much. We just kind of broadcast it, and then runoff carries it into the water supply, and then both wildlife and human health are impacted because we're not being close enough and specific enough to it. So we'll pick up here on part 3.